What's up, everybody? It's Coach Nick, and welcome to our next entry in the Exercise Science Basics video series. If you're coming here right from the introduction to the musculoskeletal and tendons video, welcome. If you've not yet seen that video, the link for it will be in the description down below. Today's entry into the video series is going to be the introduction to the neuromuscular system, and the way we're going to break down that topic for today's video is going to be going over the general organization of the nervous system. From there, we're going to move on to the basic anatomy and physiology of motor neurons and motor units. From there, we'll talk about motor unit activation, and then we will finish up on a conversation about two neuromuscular special organs that fall into a category called proprioceptors. So without further ado, let's get started with the general organization of the nervous system. To discuss the general organization of the nervous system, we are going to divide it down into the composite systems that make it up. The first two major divisions of the nervous system that we're going to be talking about are the central nervous system, which is usually abbreviated down to being CNS, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is usually abbreviated down to PNS. Your central nervous system, this consists of your brain and your spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of pretty much everything else. We're going to start over here with the central nervous system, and one of the branches within the central nervous system we're going to talk about first is going to be the autonomic branch of the nervous system. And what the autonomic branch does is all of the background automatic bodily functions that keep you alive second to second, day to day. This includes your heart function, organ function, brain function, all of the stuff that you do not have to actively think about that happens automatically thanks to the autonomic nervous system, or autonomic branch of the nervous system. Now, within the autonomic branch of the nervous system, we have two more subdivisions, the first of which is the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. The sympathetic branch of the nervous system is in charge of the three F's: fight, flight, reproduction. This is the system in your body that gets your exercise ramped up for physical activity. It gets your heart rate up, blood pumping, adrenaline, all of that kind of stuff. So the sympathetic branch of the nervous system ramps you up. Its counterpart is the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. And it is the exact opposite of the sympathetic branch. The parasympathetic branch brings everything down, reduces your heart rate, gets the adrenaline out. This brings you into a more relaxed recovery state. So we have the central nervous system, which is your brain and spinal cord. Big part of the central nervous system is the autonomic branch that takes care of everything that you don't have to actively think about. Within that, we have the sympathetic branch of the nervous system, which ramps your body up. And then we have the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, which brings your body back down. Also within the central nervous system, we have the motor cortex. Now, the motor cortex itself is very complicated in both anatomy and everything that it does. For the purposes of this introductory video, we're going to say the motor cortex is where all the information that your body is going to need to perform exercise is going to start. The next thing that we're going to move on to is going to be the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves in your body that are not a part of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, within the peripheral nervous system, we have something called the somatic branch. The somatic branch of the peripheral nervous system is going to be what is in charge of conducting the information for voluntary muscle contraction that occurs during exercise and activity, and the information that is relayed out to the periphery and then back from the periphery are carried out by two different types of neurons. The first type of neuron we're going to talk about in the peripheral nervous system are motor neurons. And motor neurons are also referred to as efferent or efferent neurons. The motor cortex from the central nervous system sends information out to the periphery, to the muscles, to try to get them to do something. That information is going to travel through the somatic branch of the peripheral nervous system, carried by motor neurons, which are going to deliver this information out to the muscles to tell them what to do. There is now going to be biological feedback after the muscles have been done what they're told to do, and that biological feedback is going to be delivered back to the central nervous system by neurons referred to as sensory neurons, also referred to as afferent or afferent neurons. So after the motor neurons deliver the information to the muscles, muscle activity is going to occur. After the muscle activity occurs, there is feedback that your body then has to make sense of. That feedback is carried back to the central nervous system by these sensory/afferent neurons. And that is going to conclude everything that we're going to talk about for the general organization of the nervous system. The next topic for us to discuss in our introduction to the neuromuscular system is going to be the basic anatomy and physiology of a motor neuron. If we look over here on the whiteboard, we already have ourselves a perfect drawing of a motor neuron. And as we know, the motor neuron is a part of the peripheral nervous system, and its job is to get information from the motor cortex to the target muscle that is going to be performing the activity. The first thing that we're going to look at in our drawing is this right here, and this is referred to as a synapse. A synapse is the location where two neurons communicate with each other, or where a neuron communicates to a muscle or a target organ. That is referred to as a synapse. In this drawing, this is our neuron coming from our motor cortex, which is sending information out to the periphery for muscles to perform an activity. So it is conducting information that is communicated across the neural synapse. That information is going to make our way to the motor neuron. The main chunk of it right here, this is just the body of our motor neuron. We'll give it a nice little nucleus right here. Now, on the main body of our neuron, we have these little bumps like this that come off of it that project out into these tentacle-like things. These little bumps are referred to as axon hillock, and the tentacles that start to come off of them, these are referred to as axons, which we'll zoom in on the structure of in just a second. So, we have our motor cortex neuron sending information out to the periphery. That information is communicated across the neural synapse. That information is then going to go into our motor neuron right here, and that information is going to communicate it out across the axons. Now, these axons are the long tentacle-like things that are going to extend out to the target muscle. On these axons, we have little bumps of myelin sheath, also referred to as neurolemma, with these little bumps in between that do not have myelin sheath. These bumps that are devoid of myelin sheath are referred to as the nodes of Raviner. And what ends up happening is once this information hits the motor neurons, an electrical impulse referred to as an action potential, something we'll get into more detail in on next video, is going to be shot across these axons towards the target muscle. What that electrical impulse actually ends up doing is it skips or jumps across these myelin sheath or neurolemma bumps, and that actually increases the nerve conduction velocity, allowing the signal to get to the target muscle more quickly. So that is how the signal is going to get conducted across here, and that's the axons. As we get closer to the end of these axons, they are going to branch out further into smaller, more numerous tentacle-like projections. And these new tentacles that are popping up at this point are referred to as dendrites. The dendrites themselves, they branch out even further into smaller tentacle-like projections like so. And these tentacle-like projections that are at the end of the dendrites, these are the end or terminal branches. And at the end of these terminal branches, this is where we find the synaptic knob. And the synaptic knob is going to interface with the target muscle, forming the synapse. The synapse, as we discussed earlier, being the location where a motor neuron communicates with another neuron, a muscle, or an organ. We're now going to zoom in on the synapse between our motor neuron and our target muscle, and we're going to look at the basic anatomy and physiology of motor units. A motor unit is a motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates or communicates with. Something that's important to note is that muscle fibers, they are monogamous. There's only one motor neuron endpoint attached to each muscle fiber, and that attachment point is located at something called the motor end plate, and that's usually at the middle part of the length of a muscle fiber. The motor neurons, on the other hand, are more polyamorous in nature, and one motor neuron can innervate multiple hundreds, maybe even thousands of muscle fibers at one time through having multiple dendrites at the end of each axon. So muscle fibers, monogamous, there's only ever one motor neuron attached to each muscle fiber at its motor end plate, and then motor neurons themselves, they can attach to any number of muscle fibers at one time. We're now going to turn back to our drawing right here, and we have the synaptic knob of the end branch of our motor neuron. Inside the synaptic knob, there's these little packages called synaptic vesicles, and they're carrying something called acetylcholine, which is usually just abbreviated down to as ACH. We're going to get into the specifics of this a little bit more next video, but what ends up happening is that electrical impulse or action potential that we were talking about finally makes it all the way from the motor cortex down to the synaptic knob of the terminal endpoint of the dendrite of our motor neuron. What's going to end up happening here is that action potential is going to cause the acetylcholine to move out of the synaptic knob into the space that is in between the motor neuron and then the target tissue. This space right here is referred to as either the synaptic or neuromuscular cleft. Those terms are synonyms, and then the communication point between this synapse and the motor end plate of the muscles form together to create the neuromuscular junction, which you will often see abbreviated down to as just NMJ. Now what ends up happening is this acetylcholine is going to interact with the motor end plate of the muscle. The communication at the neuromuscular junction is going to occur, and then the end result of that is going to be a muscle contraction. We'll go over the more specifics of that next video when we talk about sarcomeres and sliding filament theory. But that's going to be the basic anatomy and physiology of our motor neuron. The next topic for us to discuss in this video is going to be motor unit activation. Now that we know what motor units are and we understand their basic anatomy and physiology, we're going to see how the body uses them to accomplish muscular work. The first thing that we're going to discuss in regards to this topic is something referred to as motor unit recruitment. And what motor unit recruitment states is that as the force requirements for a muscular activity goes up, your neuromuscular system will recruit a greater percentage of your total available motor units. Now, if we're talking about an exercise that is low intensity, very far away from a maximum effort, your neuromuscular system is going to recruit a lower percentage of your total available motor units because more muscular force and more motor units are not required to get the activity done. As you begin to approach something that is max effort, your neuromuscular system will recruit an increasingly greater percentage of these motor units until you've recruited everything that you can for the muscular activity. Now, kind of on the same topic of motor unit recruitment, we also have something to talk about referred to as the size or threshold principle of recruitment, sometimes also referred to as Henneman's size principle of recruitment. And what this states is as the muscular force requirements for an activity go up, your body will recruit bigger, more force-capable motor units. And usually that is looked at on a graph like so, where on our x-axis right here we have the force for the exercise in question, and then we have the size of the motor unit there on the y-axis. And usually how this is demonstrated is as the arrow of the amount of force required goes up, so does the size of the average motor unit being recruited. Also on these charts, we'll see a tie-in to when we learned last video about muscle fiber types, and you'll usually see down here on the lower force part of the requirement, you will see the motor units where the motor neurons innervate type 1 muscle fibers. As we learned in our last video, the type 1 muscle fibers, they have lower total force production capabilities and they have total lower amounts of rate of force production. So it makes sense that the motor units innervating type 1 muscle fibers are going to be found much lower on the force requirement and size part of this graph. Also on these graphs is where you'll see on the bigger force component requirement is where you'll see the type 2 muscle fibers. As we learned in our last video, the type 2 muscle fibers, they are larger in size, they have higher force production capabilities, and they produce force more rapidly. So it makes sense that the motor units interacting with type 2 muscle fibers are going to be found much higher on both the size and the force component here. Now, it should be stated, as we did in the last video when we talked about muscle fiber types, there are no activities in which only a type 1 muscle fiber or type 2 muscle fiber motor unit are active. As we can see here, there is some overlap, where some type 1 muscle fibers might actually have, the really big ones, might have more force production capability as some of the smallest type 2 fibers. So that is going to be our size/threshold principle of recruitment that states that the neuromuscular system will sequentially recruit motor units in size going from smallest, least force capable to biggest, most force capable. And then motor unit recruitment states that as force goes up, you'll recruit a greater percentage of your total available motor units. Now, other things that your neuromuscular system does to control these motor units for muscular work is the firing rate of the motor units, also referred to as rate coding. Basically, what this states, as muscular force requirements go up during an activity, the neuromuscular system is going to recruit the motor units at a faster rate. One motor unit being recruited in your bicep muscle one time is not going to be enough to make a curl or a muscular contraction happening. That requires a lot of the motor units in the muscle being activated over and over and over, one motor unit recruitment activation after another, with the result being a summative contracting effort. And this is controlled through the firing rate. So your neuromuscular system, as the force requirements go up, it will recruit your motor units at a much faster turnover rate, so they will be active more quickly after a layoff period. So that's firing rate and rate coding. Another element of this that is usually left off is also the synchronicity of firing. So your neuromuscular system, in response to greater force demands, will recruit more motor units. It will start to recruit bigger, more powerful motor units, and it will start to recruit your motor units at a faster rate, but it will also learn to recruit those motor units in a more synchronized fashion. Being able to recruit more, bigger, more forceful motor units at a faster rate is all well and good for more intense muscular activity, but if all of that activation is not well synchronized, the result is going to be a less forceful, less effective muscular contraction. So your neuromuscular system over time will also be trained to activate all of these motor units in a more synchronized way so that you can take more advantage of the increased total number, size, and force, and firing rate. Our last topic to discuss in this video is going to be about two special neuromuscular organs that fall into a category called proprioceptors. The first type of proprioceptor we're going to be talking about is called a muscle spindle. And what muscle spindles do is they monitor the amount of and rate of stretch in your muscle tissue. An easy way to remember that: muscle spindle and stretch both have the S right there. If we look at our drawing right here with the black marker, we've got tendons on the either end of a muscle belly. These lines going down the muscle bellies are the muscle striations, and these are referred to as extrafusal fibers. Running parallel to and then attached to these extrafusal fibers are structures called intrafusal fibers, and these things have a little bit of a capsular structure right here in the middle, from which a sensory or afferent neuron goes to communicate with the central nervous system. Now the muscle spindles, this is the intrafusal fiber plus the capsular structure that runs parallel to the extrafusal fibers of the muscle. And these send that stretch rate and stretch amount information to the central nervous system. Now, a good example to think about how these muscle spindles work in action is to think about when you go to the doctor and they hit your knee with the reflex hammer. The reflex hammer hits your patellar/quadriceps tendon, and that sudden impact stretches the tissue around it. Because your quadriceps muscle is attached to the tendon, the quadriceps muscle tissue also gets pulled on and stretched. This stretch tension goes along the extrafusal fibers and is thereby transmitted to the intrafusal fibers. The amount of and the rate of stretch is sent out from the sensory/afferent nerve out to the central nervous system. And because of our example of the reflex hammer, the rate of stretch is instantaneous. The impact of the hammer causes the stretch to happen right away. The central nervous system gets that information and it determines that this rate of stretch is too high and that there is a risk of either tendinous and or muscular injury. And via gamma motor neuron, it will tell your quadriceps muscle to contract and shorten to try to relieve this sudden stretch position. So that is how the muscle spindle works. The stretch tension that goes along a muscle is transmitted along intrafusal fibers. That information is communicated to the CNS via a sensory or afferent nerve. And if the amount of stretch and rate of stretch is too much, the consequence is going to be the central nervous system is going to tell the muscle being stretched to shorten to try to relieve the stretch state to avoid some type of injury. So that's muscle spindles. That is our first category of proprioceptor we're going to talk about. The second category of proprioceptor we're going to be talking about is called the Golgi tendon organ. And Golgi tendon organ is usually abbreviated down to just being GTO. The Golgi tendon organ monitors the tension being transmitted from muscle tissue to the tendons it attaches to. As the name Golgi tendon organ implies, you can find this proprioceptor located in the musculotendinous junction between the muscle and the tendon it attaches to. An easy way to remember what the GTO does is it has T right in the middle of the name, T for tension monitoring. Now, the way that the GTO works is that if a muscle is at work, we can take the biceps for example, it is developing force and tension to move the weight for whatever given exercise is being done. The GTO is constantly monitoring this tension being developed and transmitted from the muscles to the tendons, and similarly to muscle spindles, it is relaying this information to the CNS via a sensory or afferent neuron. Now, in the example of, let's say that you're doing a bicep curl, and the GTO relays the amount of tension information to the CNS, if the CNS determines the amount of tension being developed by the biceps is too much to the point where either muscular and or tendinous injury will occur, the CNS will respond by communicating with the biceps muscle and telling it to start producing less force and tension to try to avoid injury. It will also communicate with the triceps muscle, the muscle that is the antagonist or the opposite of it, to co-contract to try to further remove the biceps from a too high tension position. So GTO, tension monitoring, it is located in the musculotendinous junction and it is constantly monitoring the amount of tension being transmitted from your muscles to your tendons. In the event that that tension becomes too high, the Golgi tendon organ will cause the central nervous system to reduce the amount of force and tension being provided by the target muscle, and it will co-contract and activate the opposite muscle. So that is our two proprioceptors, the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organ. And that will conclude today's entry into our Exercise Science Basics video series. That was the introduction to the neuromuscular system. If you found this video to be enjoyable and or educational, feel free to give it a like. If you have any questions about anything that I discussed during the video or anything that you would like to discuss further, feel free to leave that as a comment down below. If this type of educational content appeals to you and you'd like to see more of it, feel free to consider subscribing to the channel. Our next video, we're going to start to put together the concepts that we've learned in our first 3 videos in this series so far. And we're going to move on to the topic of sarcomeres, neuromuscular communication, and then something called sliding filament theory. If you missed our previous video, the introduction to the musculoskeletal system and the tendons, the link for both of these can be found in the description below. This has been Coach Nick, and I'll see you in the next one.